Rita Hayworth and Glenn Ford, they could be innocent, they could be steamy, and they could be incredibly sensual. But were they just friends or more than that? I don't have the definitive answer to that because I didn't know them, but I do have about 40 years of research under my belt, and I have a strong opinion. And I don't know if it's going to be one that most will agree with, but here goes. Rita and Glenn first appeared in the film The Lady in Question together, and that was released in 1940 and was directed by Charles Vidor. He would subsequently direct them in 2 more films. When you compare the publicity photos from this film to the ones made later in their careers for Gilda and Affair in Trinidad, it's unbelievable how innocent they look. They didn't show the chemistry yet in this film that they were to show later, but they became fast friends during the making of this film. But the chemistry really kicked in 6 years later in 1946 when they made Gilda together. The chemistry is palpable on screen and is during the making of this film where the rumors began that they were having a love affair. This was in part because Rita was separated from her husband at the time, Orson Welles, and also because Glenn Ford later told stories about how Harry Cohn, the head of Columbia, was bugging their dressing rooms and they were, quote, giving him something to listen to, unquote. So that leaves the door open as to whether what they were doing was real or pretend. But here's where my opinion comes in. Rita knew that Glenn Ford was quite a womanizer. He had been married to Eleanor Powell for many years and was quite a ladies' man, and by his own admission was cheating often. Rita was also vulnerable at that time, which could have made her susceptible to Glenn Ford, but she was also seeing Tony Martin during the time that she was separated from Orson Welles. And she was not one to have 2 men at the same time, for lack of a better phrase. If they did have an affair during the making of Gilda, and I don't think they did, it was soon over because she got back together with Orson Welles. She made Down to Earth. She then made The Lady from Shanghai with Orson Welles, and they were definitely together during that period. In fact, Glenn Ford visited them on the set of the film, as you can see in these photos that show what good friends Rita and Glenn were. So even though Lady from Shanghai was released in 1948, it had actually been made in 1946. And she then, after that movie, had to go off to Europe for a publicity junket and also to let her hair grow out. When she came back, she started filming The Loves of Carmen with Glenn Ford, again directed by Charles Vidor. And though he loved working with Rita again, Glenn Ford was very vocal about hating this movie and this role. He played Don Jose, kind of a pushover. And later, when Rita appeared on This Is Your Life for Glenn Ford, she commented on how they used to laugh at the tight pants he had to wear. Even though Glenn Ford didn't like this film, it is incredible to see them in color together. It's a very lush film, and Rita looks absolutely gorgeous. After the release of The Loves of Carmen, Rita went to Europe again, met Prince Ali Khan, and married him in 1949, and left Europe in 1951, and eventually their divorce was final in 1953. But when she came back in 1951, she had to work again, and so she began Affair in Trinidad, again with Glenn Ford, but with director Vincent Sherman this time around. And this film was made in an attempt to kind of bring back her Gilda image after having been away from the screen for several years. And even though they still had incredible chemistry on the screen, and they were the best of friends, of course, off the screen, the film was pretty much a dud. It was a poor imitation of Gilda, and even though it was hailed as her comeback film, it bombed. And ironically, it wasn't Glenn Ford with whom she was engaging in any kind of affair during the making of the movie, but it actually was the director. According to Vincent Sherman, They had kind of a one-night stand based on Rita's loneliness. With publicity shots like this, their last film together, The Money Trap, in 1965, was a bit of a shock. Even though they had both aged beautifully, Rita was having a hard time memorizing her lines because the beginnings of Alzheimer's were beginning to show. And also she was over 40, so she was having a hard time finding work, as many women did back in Hollywood at that time. Glenn Ford had a pretty steady stream of work throughout his career. In the ensuing years after The Money Trap was released, the two were often seen around Hollywood socially, and they lived very close to each other in the Beverly Hills area, behind the Beverly Hills Hotel. There were often "what are they doing now" type interviews with Rita in the 60s and 70s, and she would talk about how Glenn Ford's TV antenna was blocking her view, and it was all said with good humor. But when the interviewers would ask her whether or not there was anything going on between her and Glenn, she would literally laugh and say, "What? Are you kidding? He's like my brother." I know that Glenn Ford's son, Peter Ford, has intimated that there was much more going on between them, and who am I to say? But I do feel that Glenn Ford was deeply, deeply loved Rita Hayworth. I also think he was in love with her. I think Rita Hayworth loved Glenn Ford deeply as a friend, but was not in love with him. And I think the idea of them having this long love affair of 30 plus years, this star-crossed love affair, has just kind of grown with the years, because that's what people want to believe. That's just my opinion, though. I always found it kind of sad that Glenn Ford wasn't able to visit Rita Hayworth when she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. Apparently, it was just too difficult for him. I do understand it, though. And he was a pallbearer at her funeral, and said he had lost his best friend. So it's a beautiful relationship. Whatever it was in reality, we do know that it was a very strong, deep, long-lasting friendship, and a beautiful one.